Hi, this is Yulia Sion. I'm a researcher in haptics and wearable tech, and today I will host this episode on haptics. Today we will talk about the importance of touch for our well-being and how we can harness this underrepresented sense through technology. And my guest today is Michael Banissy. Michael is a award-winning professor in social neuroscience and a science communicator. He has authored over 100 scientific publications and has featured across various outlets, including BBC, Cosmopolitan, Vice, Times, you name it. He also has received multiple prizes for his contributions to psychological science, including a medal from the British Psychological Society for outstanding contributions to psychology. And currently, Michael teaches at Bristol University, and he's also head of psychological science there. Hello, Michael. Thank you for chatting with me today. I'm really excited what you're gonna talk about today. How is your day going?
Yeah, it's all good, thank you. Yeah, and thank you for having me. It's really nice to be here talking to you. So it's yeah, good.
Yeah, you're one of the few actually neuroscientists of touch. So probably our conversation will be more about like fundamental questions about around the touch, more so than technology. So I'm very actually excited about this conversation. And maybe to start with, since there are actually very few people, researchers specifically in touch in this world known to us, it would be amazing if you could share your story. How did you get into this direction of research? Why specifically touch? Why science of touch? Anything you'd like to share with us would be great.
Yeah, sure thing. So I suppose there's two tales to this really. One side is I'm really interested and always have been since a very young age in social interactions, how people interact with one another, how we build and maintain relationships. And actually, for me, touch is a really important part of that on a personal level. And I guess as I then moved into research, I was somewhat surprised very early on in my career to actually see that it was maybe not as researched as much as some of the other senses. A lot of the work that I saw growing up in a research lab during my PhD was dominated by things like studies of visual emotions and things like this. And of course, those are really important to our social interactions. But I was always wondering, well, where are the other senses? Where's the tactile component, and so forth? And so one side of it was driven through a kind of personal motivation and interest there. Another side of it came from the fact that very early on in my career, I started working with on synesthesia. So this rather rare experience where the senses get merged. And I was really lucky to very early on work with a group of people who there wasn't too much research about them. These were people who had vision touch synesthesia. So when they saw somebody being touched or they saw somebody in pain, they would feel tactile sensations on their own body. And so that was really where a lot of my research very much started. That was what my PhD was on. And actually that work tried to look at how those tactile experiences were important to things like empathy and sharing other people's experiences. And from there, I kind of branched out and become much more interested in touch as a sense, because, I was working with people who were literally feeling the tactile experiences of others. So in order to understand their experiences, I needed to understand how touch was working and how it brought us together in everyday life as well. So that was somewhat the journey I went on really with touch research.
That's very fascinating. Actually, maybe we'll talk about synesthesia and your research is synesthesia a bit later, because this is something very fascinating actually to know a bit more. And as I understand, you published your book recently, right? It's called When We Touch. I think it has two names, right? But the European name is When We Touch. And I believe it's based on, and as I know, it's based on this big research project based on 113 countries, right?
Yeah,
study case.
That's right. Yeah. So it's
And you'll talk a bit more about it one second. But in the description of this book, it says that the book basically represents an exploration of the new science behind our most underappreciated sense and why we need to harness the power of touch for our health and well-being. So now I have like several questions actually. One question, or maybe just if you could share a bit more about this book, what it is about, briefly, and then the other two questions are related to these words underappreciated. So basically, why touch is underappreciated, and then why do we need to harness it? Why do we need to bargain with that? And you also mentioned previously that when you started your research in touch, you realized there's so much in vision and also audio modalities, right? But not much about touch. Why?
Yeah, I think it's so I guess to answer the first part of the question to begin with. So
Sorry,
the book
too many
is,
questions.
yeah, so the book, as you say, it's called When We Touch. In North America, it's also called Touch Matters. So in North America, it has a different title to the rest of the world. But When We Touch is the original title, I guess, of the book. It's very much all about, I suppose, touch in everyday life, those everyday situations where we use touch, and why it's important, and the implications touch can have on things like our health, our well-being, even down to something as simple as how we might buy products in a supermarket, or we might be convinced if a robot touches us to agree to a request. So it's a really broad, wide-ranging book. It kind of covers touch and health, touch and well-being, touch in our relationships, but also touch in society, and how more and more we might see some of these digital forms of touch coming in, and how that might play out in different settings, whether that's a care home, in a supermarket, etc. And like you say, it really stemmed on the back of a very large study that we did early in 2020, which involved around 40,000 people worldwide. It was called the Touch Test. We did this with the British Broadcast Corporation in the UK, the BBC. And in that, we asked many questions about the meaning of touch in the world today. And of course, we launched that in January 2020 without any knowledge what was around the corner, which was, of course, COVID and pandemic-related restrictions.
So timely, isn't it?
So it became, it became incredibly timely. Although actually, to be honest, one media source called it the most ill-timed study ever carried out. so that's the other way to look at it. But I did think it was timely, actually, and
I think
and
so,
it was. And actually, I think COVID was part of the reason why I somewhat came to talk somewhat about touch as one of our most underappreciated senses, because I think for a lot of us, it wasn't until touch was taken away from us during the pandemic and some of those pandemic restrictions. And by that, I mean things like not being able to touch products or touch things when you're out on the streets, or being, at least in the UK, we had national lockdowns, where you couldn't see your friends and you couldn't engage in, I don't know, a hug with a family member. There were all these things that were taken away. And I think in those moments, a lot of us began to realize, well, actually, I'm really missing something crucial in my life here. And I think it drew that awareness, because touch is the kind of sense that it's with us all the time. I mean, even talking to you right now, right? I'm sitting here on my chair, my feet are pressing on the floor. I'm getting all sorts of tactile feedback that I'm not even thinking about. But it's so important to ground me in the moment. It's so important for, if you and I were to meet and we were to, I don't know, shake hands before we meet, it has a huge impact on how much we're likely to listen to each other, how much we're likely to build a sense of trust and connection between each other. If someone gives you a hug, I don't know, unless you're getting supportive hugs in your life, it's been shown that the greater frequency of hugging that people can have can sometimes protect them from things like stressful events, or it can protect them from the likelihood of developing virus symptoms and stuff like this. So there's a lot of ways that touch has these hidden impacts on us. And for me, that's why some would call it an underappreciated sense, because I don't think we often stop and think about touch in that way. Like, we might think that a hug feels nice. We might think somebody giving us a hug feels good, but how often do we stop and think, well, what are the impacts of that on my physical and mental health? And the answer is they're pretty powerful, actually. They're pretty important. And so this is, to me, where it kicks in. And I suppose, and like I said at the very start, in terms of a research sense, I think our awareness of this is quite new. I think a lot of the work on touch over the years has focused on what we call the discriminative aspects of touch. So your ability to make fine discriminations between an object, feel those differences. It hasn't really been until, probably the past 30 odd years or so that people have started to really dig into that, I suppose, more emotional side of touch, right? That why does a pleasant touch feel good? What
Do you
are the
have any
impacts of that?
idea? Yeah, do you have any idea why this happened? Why is so underappreciated by the community in a sense of research or even investment, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's really hard to unpack that, I think. I mean, I think investment and funding, there's many factors that play a role in that, in terms of where priorities are at a given time. And I think, I think vision often has dominated in sensory research, and I think that is because vision is such a dominant sense that we as people tend to use.
By the way, for only those who have vision, right? So that's kind of,
exactly. Yeah, no, for those where it's available, it becomes a dominant sense in that way. And I think vision's also been particularly more amenable to research methods. So you've got to think about the methodologies you can use, and actually some of the other senses sometimes are harder to work with, right? So with something like vision, you can use a very static image on a screen to study vision. If you wanted to study sound or something like touch, it's much more dynamic. You're dealing with something that is much more harder to sometimes control and manipulate in a lab. So I think there's methodological components, and as I said, with regards to the affective side of things, this idea about how does a pleasurable touch feel good, and what are the impacts on that? Some of that, I think, was also driven by the fact it wasn't really until the 1990s that we became aware that in our skin, we have receptors that are specifically more likely to respond to things like slow, gentle strokes from somebody else. So that kind of calming, soothing touch. And I think with that almost kind of giving that biological underpinning to that type of experience, suddenly more science started to then dig into it. So sometimes you need those types of validations to drive a field forward. And I think that did make a big difference, certainly when those studies came out in the 1990s.
Very good points, because that's something I'm very, very curious about also in my research, actually. So this leads actually to my next question. So the sense is kind of underappreciated, right? And we don't have as much research done yet as in comparison to vision, for instance, right? So now at this point in time, how can we move forward? Basically, how can we harness it? And from your perspective, can technology help? Is it ready? What should we pay attention at the moment when it comes to, let's say, mediated touch technologies?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I think technology is going to be a huge part of thinking about touch research moving forward, particularly because one of the things that we know from a lot of, not just my own work, but also from several labs around the world, even going back to 2015 onwards, people have been reporting that more and more people say they have a lack of touch in their lives. They feel they're not getting the amount of touch that they need. And for some people, these are connected to things like loneliness, depression, anxiety, and things like this. And they say some of that is because they haven't got people around to touch, right? They haven't got that chance, or they do, but people aren't giving it to them to some degree. And I think actually,
so we have a scientific proof of that, right? That people are actually deprived from touch.
So yeah, so for instance, in our 2020 study, we asked people, about their experience with touch in their lives, and we found that 54% of people in the worldwide sample, that 40,000 people, said they don't have enough touch in their lives.
54, right?
54. Only 4% said they had too much. So 54% was the highest proportion. As time has gone on, there was a study that came out later in that year. Admittedly, we had COVID restrictions, right? But 80% of people in that study were reporting they weren't having enough touch in their lives. And prior to all of this work from Corey Floyd, who's based at the University of Arizona, had shown that people who had more touch hunger, which is what we tend to talk about this about, it's not so much touch deprivation, it's touch hunger, because touch deprivation means you're completely deprived. Touch hunger means you're not getting the amount of touch that you desire, which is an important distinction, right? Because you might have, perceptively, people might say, well, you get loads of touch in your life, but if it's not aligning with your needs, that's where the challenges kick in, right?
Yeah.
And so and this is quite a serious thing, and I do think technology offers some opportunities to help here, and there is data coming out already showing how some touch substitutes, whether that's, you know, cushions that breathe and you can hold and they hug, or robotic pets, or different types of touch technology through haptics, where, I don't know, even let's say you wear a bracelet and someone sends you a signal on your wrist that's a tactile signal, but just to show you they're thinking of you, these types of things can have impacts, at least on some of the physiological responses.
But that's the question. So can we make a point here? So when someone sends you some sort of tactile output, right, or tactile message, you call it, right, in a simple way, does it have a physiological effect, or maybe it's more about the meaning and more like our comprehension that someone is thinking about us without actually feeling that physiological effect from actual touch?
So I think that's a really important question. I think research is now looking to unpack, right? So is a digital touch the same in terms of the receptors and the responses to an actual touch? And the likelihood is, if you're getting a vibration versus someone stroking your arm, that's going to activate a very different receptor, right? Practically.
Exactly. You know. That's what I'm getting towards.
But an important part of why touch helps us is because of what it means. So I mentioned earlier about a study. This was done by researchers at Carnegie Mellon and a range of other universities back in 2014, I think, or maybe 2015. My memory of the years slightly off there, but basically what they did was they tracked people for 2 weeks, and they just asked them a series of questions, diary study, and in one of it they said, how often are you getting a hug? And then after those 2 weeks, they brought people into the lab and they exposed them to a virus, and it was like a common cold, right? And they saw, and then they quarantined these people and saw how likely is the virus to develop? What is the symptom development? And what they found was that people who had more hugs 14 days before were less likely to develop the virus symptoms. So there was this relationship. One of the important reasons why hugs had that effect was because people said the hugs conveyed a meaning of social support. So that it wasn't just the physical act of someone hugging you, it was the meaning of that hug as well, right? The hug conveyed social support. So you might imagine if you have a digital touch that conveys social support, it may carry some benefits. Yeah, because you don't necessarily need to have that. If part of it is about showing our support to one another, in principle, you might be able to do that through tech. I don't think tech will do it all, but in principle, there's some scope.
But I'm still wondering, then we could transfer the same meaning through a text message, right?
Yep.
Would be the same meaning, right? But touch is very powerful. The real touch is very powerful from the perspective of conveying the emotion, right?
Yep.
And it actually does it in a very implicit way, right? Somewhat. So that's why the question is that, can this tactile or mediated touch technology be more powerful just because it's affecting our skin receptors versus just our vision and comprehension?
And I think that's a really important point. So go back to that hugging study, right? The fact that hugs conveyed social support explains some of the variance in the data. It doesn't explain all of it. So some of it is about that physical connection. And I think that's harder. It does exist, right? That's harder to get through tech. But on the flip side, if I'm playing devil's advocate, there is now some tech coming out where people can convey emotions through the tech, and people can detect the emotions. So there's this really interesting work on mid-air touch. This is using things like ultrasound waves. And actually, you know, if, for instance, we were in the same room right now and I was trying to convey to you, I don't know, an emotion of anger or an emotion of sympathy through touch, and I was physically doing that, you'd be pretty good at detecting that emotion. These are the kind of emotions we can detect quite well with touch. But there are now research asking people to do the same thing, but rather than someone else touching them, they're experiencing it through mid-air touch, through these ultrasound waves, and someone else is trying to convey through those waves that emotion, and they're just as good. They're good at detecting with ultrasound waves and this mid-air touch. So the emotions. So arguably, there is a potential in the future where that might get better. I don't think it's there yet. but
it's just a matter of technology, of understanding those parameters, how to tweak them in a way to like really simulate its feelings, right?
But also, I mean, keep in mind, we're talking about this as touch, right? There's another problem or challenge for tech, which is, the smell of someone when they touch you will impact your response. The look of someone when they touch you will impact. So how do you, if you're really going to try and capture it, and this for me is why I don't think you could ever really capture the full sensory experience, right? Because you've got to blend all those things together to really get to it. Yeah, but I do think there are ways. I think there are some ways in which the technology can be helpful, and I think data is starting to show that. So if you are particularly isolated, having technology to provide you some tactile interaction, I think that could be a good thing. However, is it as good as a real person? That's a different question.
It needs to be tested much further, definitely. But the next question is also related to technology, but also your previous research, also to your book. Because touch, again, as we already talked with you, is very context related. It's really important. Who is touching you, when it happens, right? And all these aspects, in what situation. And I think your book also touches upon those differences, right? In terms of like cultural differences for touch, but also universal similarities, which are also very important. Could you please touch upon them briefly? What are the universal similarities for touch and the differences, specifically cultural differences?
Yes, I mean, I suppose kicking off with some of the similarities. I mean, so a lot of the similarities come in forms of things like, I suppose, physical expressions of affection. So if you actually look at it, there's a lot of similarities, at least in terms of things like holding hands, hugging, kissing, these types of behaviors as forms of affection across different cultures.
So all cultures like hugs. Are there any cultures that don't like hugs?
I think we need to be careful to say all cultures like hugs, because it's just like saying, I don't think we could say all individuals like hugs, even within a culture, right? There will be some individuals that don't, right? So touch is, it's loaded with emotion. There's past experiences, present experiences, future experiences, a lot of stuff that folds into it. But it is true that actually, I mean, one of the questions that we asked in the touch test, which was really quite simple. I mean, we said, what does touch mean to you? Give us just 3 basic words, right? Really simple question. But around the world, consistently, things like comfort, affection, support, warmth, love, these were the words that came out. They were there for men, women, non-binary adults. They were there for people with visual impairment, mobility impairment, across all sorts of different groups. Those words came out. So universally, maybe not universally, but across a whole range of world regions, we tend to think about some of these comforting forms of touch, right? There can be a level of comfort, and there can also be some similarities in feelings of appropriateness about touch. So there are studies comparing different cultures and what they think is appropriate or not appropriate, and where on the body, for instance, someone is okay to touch you if they're a stranger, or if they're a partner, or if they're a friend or a sibling. And you see there's lots of similarities in this. A lot of this work has come out of labs in Finland, where they've compared, for instance, European and Japanese adults, or they've compared across different European regions. And you find that, as you might expect, we find more of the body to be appropriate for people to touch if we have a closer emotional bond to them than if we don't. So emotional bonds, that's a pretty cultural similarity there. But there are, of course, differences. And some of those differences are, for instance, cultural norms. In some cultures, a handshake is an acceptable thing. In other cultures, people don't want to engage in that. For some, I don't know, some cultures will kind of do the kind of air kiss on the cheek style interaction as a greeting, right? So there are differences in some of these kind of dynamics that kick out. There's also differences in terms of the frequency of touch. So for instance, there's some quite well-known work going back to the 1960s, and there's some debates about this now, but it was a study which looked at how often people touched in coffee shops over an hour. And they found, for instance, in Puerto Rico, people were touching around about 160 times an hour, versus in the UK, they were touching 0 times an hour, right? And I should flag, more recent research suggests that actually it's probably not that much of a difference. And actually, there were some methodological questions over that original work in the 1960s. But it's just an example, right? There are some of these differences, and you do see some of those things come out. So there's some variation in it. But I think one of the things about touch is I think we do place a lot of focus on culture as being some of the driving factors in differences, and certainly cultural norms and context can play a role. But as we said already, even within a culture, there can be lots of other factors that arguably might matter more when it comes to our preferences. So one of the things that really matters about our preferences towards touch are things like our personality types. So whether you're more extroverted or introverted, our attachment styles can also play a role. So some
attachment
people,
styles?
yeah, so attachment styles relate to, I suppose, our behaviors when we're in relationships, whether we're looking for physical closeness, whether we want to be more standoff from our partners, more aloof, all of these different types of behaviors people might choose. And we can obviously flex throughout our lives, and we might have different, I suppose, preferences at one time than another. But typically you find that people who are more, what people say, more avoidant in their attachment style, so people who tend to be, they want to be more independent from their partners. You know, for instance, they were less impacted by the COVID lockdowns and the lack of touch than, let's say, someone who has a more anxious attachment style and is seeking reassurance from a partner more often. So there's nuances like that. But things like attachment, things like personality, these types of factors tend to be perhaps, you know, arguably more prominent when it comes to asking questions like, do you prefer
more
touch
than even cultural aspects, right?
Yeah, I mean, cultural aspects matter. I don't want to reduce them, but I think, yeah, certainly those cultural differences are there, but there's also quite a lot of cultural similarities. So then within that culture, it's all about those other nuances like personality, gender, age, all these factors, and that can play a role.
And I assume there are like standardized questionnaires that you probably also use, right? Because it's so important to probably differentiate that for your studies, right?
For sure, yeah. So there's all sorts of measures. There's all sorts of measures about people's touch experiences and attitudes, and you know they might break down to things like childhood touch, you know, touch with friends and family, touch with strangers, right? There's other measures that look at social touch attitudes, and then of course, yeah, there are and those are standardized measures, and then there's also standardized questionnaire measures looking at things like personality, looking at attachment, and these have all been used in various studies, empathy, etc. There's all sorts of different ways that you can touch into that.
Right. Great, thank you. These already methodological aspects, but they're extremely important when you like think about your recruitment strategies, right, for your studies.
Yeah, they are. Yeah, for sure.
So let's go further into a bit of more details in terms of your other studies you've done. So I know you did quite a bit of research on non-invasive brain neurostimulation, and I've seen some of your interviews, and in one of those you talk about creativity and how our brain may enter into very specific kind of frequency range that somehow can augment or facilitate the creative process. And I wonder, because I was kind of also working in that direction for my kind of exploratory studies, can we actually achieve such a frequency state by applying a specific vibrotactile, let's say, or maybe other haptic type of output to our body, not to our brain?
Yeah. So it's a really interesting question. So our work and the work of others has shown that there's a particular, I suppose, firing rate of brain activity, a frequency that you talk about, which is typically this kind of theta or alpha range that appears to be important for creative thinking, creative processes. And I know there is
getting into this state of flow, right? We are talking about this state of flow.
And it's actually a frequency range that has been shown to be a correlate of things like rest and relaxation and stuff like this. And so I know there is work that, for instance, uses sound and uses sound waves to try to nudge people into that state, because often if you have an external stimulus, you can entrain that activity. So for instance, I don't know, if while we were talking now, there was like a visual stimulus that was flickering on the screen, that might nudge us, our brain waves, towards that
and make
frequency.
us more creative now.
Right. And so I don't know of any work that's tried it with haptics. It's an interesting empirical question. Could you do it?
But how do you think, because you've been working with touch, is there any potential? Do you see any potential?
Well, I mean,
because vibration, right? In a sense, it's a frequency, right? So
I'd be really interested in running the study. So if you want to run it, this is an offer
okay, let's do it. I would love it.
Let's do it because well, I mean, we've done it in a different way, or we've been involved in research that's done something slightly different with vibration. But what we've tried to do with vibration is we've said, okay, we know that there's like particular heartbeat frequencies that are connected to things like relaxation and lower anxiety and lower stress. So can we use, if we, for instance, put a wearable on someone and we vibrate that wearable at that frequency, can that have a beneficial effect on their anxiety and their stress? And not only ourselves, but also other labs, many other labs actually have found that that's the case. So you can use haptic wearables to induce these kind of heart rate frequencies that can then lower stress or be beneficial to someone's anxiety. So
basically you modulate the heartbeat, right? Basically you kind of vibrate at a low rate, and then your heart and then your heart rate kind of adapts to this rate.
And so I think it'd be really interesting to ask that question of could you use a similar vibratory frequency to optimize to somebody's alpha frequency in the brain and see the impact on creativity? I'd be really interested in that because, and I think, I mean, you know, my take on this would be, I think you would want to personalize it to the individual because every individual will have a slightly different personalized peak. So a lot of the work now with oscillations and frequencies is showing that, you know, for instance, alpha frequency can be between a range, right? So, you know, so for you, it might be at 10 hertz. For someone else, it might be at like 9.8 or something like that. So if you get that frequency right, can you then optimize to that and see an impact on the creativity? That's an interesting study, I think.
And also not only creativity, right? All other states. For instance, if you take music, right? Music affects our emotional state, maybe not for a prolonged period of time, but it can make us feel more melancholic or more happy or more energetic or vice versa, more relaxed. So the question, can we do the same with, you know, vibration, because it's more implicit? There are some.
This is the thing. I've seen lots of people do it with vision, and lots of people do it with sound, but less people do it with vibration and touch. And that's why I think it'd be really interesting. I mean, I would predict it should work. But that might be the researcher's curse there, right? So often research tells you the opposite of what you predict. So.
Right, especially if you're like biased because you love this research, right? But yeah, we should talk about it further.
For sure.
Okay, so then how do you think, like from your perspective, besides relaxation, right, inducing relaxation or maybe potentially creativity using mediated touch, what other like most promising maybe use cases where you see mediated touch beneficial for humankind?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, I think we're already seeing some examples of this. So one example I think is in terms of safety, actually. So I think increasingly you're seeing touch technology being shown to be an incredibly important part of making certain activities in the world a safer place. So for instance, let's say bomb disposal. I know that's a really specific example, but there's work showing that now you can send in the robots and you can do work with that kind of that technology to try to, you know, effectively deactivate, move the bomb away. But one of the keys for that to work is it's sending haptic feedback to the operator and they're feeling vibrations. And those vibrations are really important to that type of experience. Or give them more maybe daily experience that we might become more common for a lot of us, is increasingly you're seeing more things like these remote medical procedures, right? So you can now have a situation where, you know, you can have a surgeon doing a procedure from miles away, controlling a robot that's doing it, and it needs to be guided. And a really important part of making sure that's safe is making sure there is haptic feedback going to the surgeon, right? So they need to feel and get that, and that comes. So I think that side of things is going to be a really important area moving forward. I arguably think it already is an important part of where we're at. For me, I also think, as someone who works on social relationships and someone who works social well-being and health and that side of things, I think there's a really important place for digital touch, whether that's from a robot, whether that's through other means, in the context of haptic wellness. So this idea that we can use haptics to induce and improve people's well-being.
Mm-hmm.
You could maybe use robotic companions to provide some kind of tactile, whether it's a hugging robot, all these different factors.
Mm-hmm.
I think these kind of components, I think, could start to kick in. And I think increasingly, as we move into a more remote world, and as we are seeing increasingly more people reporting things like loneliness, reporting lack of touch in their lives, I think these technologies are going to become even more important, whether you're in a relationship or not, right? I think it works both ways. If you're in a relationship, but it's a remote relationship, I think having access to technologies to share those types of experiences, that tactile connection, I think is important. I think, whether you don't have that around you and you're just looking for some other form of companionship, I think there's ways technology
Can help us be more empathic.
Empathic's an interesting question. I think empathy is a difficult construct, actually, because it's once you stop and think about it, there's so many layers to it, right? There's emotion recognition, there's sharing the emotion, there's thinking about the emotion. But I mean, a lot of the work on touch and empathy actually connects it more to the emotional side of things. So if you see somebody upset and you feel upset, so I guess there's a dynamic to that. So when you're saying help us be more empathic, I guess we've got to think about, well, how would it help us get there and what aspect of it?
I was just thinking also in terms of connection to synesthesia and your research on synesthesia. Can synesthesia teach us something about empathy and
for sure
transferable to others who do not experience synesthesia?
Yeah, no, it is. I would argue it already is. So with the people that experience mirror touch synesthesia, so the people who feel touch when they see other people being touched, what we've shown is that they activate similar parts of the brain as when they experience touch themselves. And in fact, we all do that, but they tend to overactivate this. And part of the reason they do this is because they have a difficulty in, I suppose, inhibiting other people. So we all have this ability we have a representation of ourselves and a representation of someone else. And let's say I see somebody in pain. In that scenario, to share their experience, I need to promote their experience, but inhibit my own, right? So I know, say, you're in pain, I'm not. I've got to focus on you. But there's a point where I might start to get overwhelmed if I see you in pain and I'm feeling that all the time, right? In which case I want to focus away from you and onto me. I want to take the focus off you so I can calm myself. Now, people that have mirror touch synesthesia have a bit of a difficulty in that focusing away aspect, to the extent that they start to literally feel the sensations of other people. There's this kind of regulation question. And that shows us that this regulation is important to empathy. And actually what we've now shown is that training people to get better in that regulation, whether you're a synesthete or not, can impact your empathic responses to other people. Because imagine a scenario where, I don't know, I'm sharing your pain, but I'm getting overwhelmed by it, but I have a difficulty focusing away from you and onto myself. All that's going to happen is I'm going to share your pain so much that I get overwhelmed and I maybe won't be helpful to you anymore, because I just might want to just withdraw. So in that scenario, we need to train people in that self-other behavior. And that's something that we have been doing. And we've particularly been doing that in professions, whereby maybe sometimes too much empathy can lead to burnout. So sometimes in healthcare professions, it can be overwhelming. And so we've been working in those spaces based on what we've learned from synesthesia to think about how can we do some approaches that can help people regulate their empathy and have more, should we say, motivated empathy in their daily lives.
Impressive. This is a very interesting angle to actually think about it, the regulation, right? Because if you become overwhelmed, you can't help anymore. Yeah, very interesting. Thank you for sharing. I have two more questions. I know we are running out of time, but I really want to ask them, if you don't mind. One very interesting question that I'm kind of also wondering about in my research is the memory, actually. And because there is research, right, that, for instance, smell can elicit deep memories, right? It's a very powerful sense in eliciting deep childhood memories. How about touch? Because there are some studies that touch has also kind of a power to elicit certain memories. And then if that's the case, and I'm talking about the real touch, if real touch can elicit forgotten memories or make them brighter, so forth, can we actually harness technology for helping maybe people with dementia who'd like to remember something?
Yeah, I think this is really important. I mean, for me, I think there's a strong link between the senses and memory, right? And I think you see that in you've seen it in a variety of care homes now, where they build these kind of what we might call nostalgia rooms, where they've got like the sounds and the music playing of an old time, an older period, and suddenly the patients, who maybe are often quite quiet and reserved, might come to life and might start sharing. They have these kind of triggers for memory that come back from that context. And touch is a really important part of that as well, I would argue, because again, you know, it goes back to even now, if we have a memory of this experience later, there's something about me sitting here and the sensations that I'm getting that I'm probably not paying attention to, right? And we do know that from research that, you know, if you just get people to hold objects, even for 10 seconds, and you don't tell them anything about a memory test, but you just get them to hold them blindfolded sometimes or whatever, you know, there's different varieties of this. When you ask people later what objects they've held, if you give them lots of objects and they do a memory test, people are about 95% correct at getting those objects. Even 1 week later, they can be like 85% correct just from touch alone. So touch is a really powerful source to build memories. And it is a really important trigger to memory. So I think it'll be really interesting. I mean, I think, like a lot of things that we spoke about this earlier about technology and touches, I suspect it's not just going to be one sense alone, right? I think, you know, a trigger to an event and to a memory, there's going to be a smell, there's going to be a sound, there's going to be a tactile component, a visual component. So I suspect that combination is really important to the process.
Right, yeah, for sure. Thank you. All right, so let's then maybe finalize our conversation by you giving an advice. I think that would be wonderful, because as a neuroscientist, right, someone who researches the fundamental aspects of touch, can you suggest something to the engineers or so-called hapticians, right, who design mediated touch or haptic sensations? Is there anything that we should look at, right? Something that maybe overlooked, or maybe some underestimated paths for the mediated touch, or maybe some studies that you should look at those studies, or look at these offers, or look at something else, like anything that you think of that you could suggest the practitioners who design the mediated touch technologies?
Yeah, well, I mean, first things first.
Because we are lost sometimes, you know, it's not very structured field yet.
Yeah, well, if I was going to recommend one paper, it's a paper that it's currently a preprint, so it's currently on one of the archive websites, but it's by Julian Packheiser, and it's a meta-analysis and a systematic review looking at the different touch interventions, but it looks at both human to human, but also digital and mediated touch interventions. And it's looking at the physical and mental health outcomes. And it's actually one of the conclusions, as I recall in that, is that, you know, interventions with objects or robots and things like this can have similar physical but lower mental health benefits than human interactions. And it outlines some considerations for thinking about how it might want to do research on that in the future. So I think that one, for me, is
can you repeat the name, please, again? And then I'll definitely ask you maybe to send me a link on to the
sure.
article. We can post it also on the website, but for those who don't check the website, maybe the name just of the author at least.
Yeah, so it's Julian Packheiser.
Okay.
Based at the Netherlands Institute of Neuroscience, Netherlands Institute for Neuroscience, I think, which is in Amsterdam. I mean, Julian's work in general is just excellent. He does some fantastic work. This review is really good because it summarizes the whole field, which is amazing, useful for everybody. But actually his own research that's been done on things like hugging and other areas like this is really good, strong empirical work. So I recommend Julian's work across the board. I think definitely look out for work there. So that was one paper. What was the rest of the question?
That was very specific. Maybe any other directions? I don't know. Maybe like you guys look more into the synesthesia, you can learn a lot, or like look into this direction, we need more research there, or anything else that you feel like you could suggest to practitioners.
Yeah, I think the thing for me, we've spoke slightly about this already, right? About the idea that I think a lot of the work that we see come out focuses on the senses in isolation. And actually, I think looking at this idea of multisensory interaction and looking at the work, for instance, how I don't know, things like smell can impact our responses to touch, and looking at all these kind of sensory dynamics that come together. I think is particularly important. Charles Spencer's work, there's a really good example of a researcher who does a lot of cross-modal work and actually has done some really interesting things about tactile illusions that come from different cross-modal interactions. And I think if we really want to start using, I suppose, haptic technology to reflect touch, something similar to touch in the real world, we need to become very aware of these cross-modal links, and so I think that's one area. And the other area being, as I say, being someone who really is more from a social neuroscience background and just that social relationships, I would say just keep that work going that's looking at how touch and digital and mediated touch can be useful in that scenario of things like loneliness, relationship satisfaction, that side of things, because that idea of touch as a comforting source, as a way for social support, it's such an important, powerful way to impact someone's health and well-being, that I think the more we can get options for that, the better, really.
Thank you. It's kind of a very dear statement to my heart because, as I research in this direction, also social kind of touch, I'm very happy to hear that we need that and there is a potential. Well, thank you so much. I think we stayed longer than expected, but I'm very happy you kind of engaged with me with all these questions, and really appreciate your time. Thank you.
Yeah, no, pleasure. Been lovely talking. Thank you so much too.